Hello and welcome back to another episode of Wise Words Book Summaries. Today we are doing The Sports Gene by, is it David Epstein?
Yeah, not Jeffrey Epstein.
It is. yeah, that was something that he just did on the side, other than running that ring. That's thrown me.
This book, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, essentially, this book is about essentially identifying the genes that are responsible for certain kind of enhanced performances of different sports, and kind of takes a look at like different genes and different stories of people who possess those genes and how they've become like performers or athletes or whatnot. It's like, because I literally have just done a module on behavioral genetics, which is essentially how the environment affects our behavior, or our genes, and affects our behavior. So I kind of had to go into a bit of complexity with the module. So this book, I think, is a bit more rudimentary, and it's obviously it's an easy read, and it's a nice read if you're just scratching the surface. But we were just saying, a lot of the kind of like main points are very embedded in the stories and quite hard to
extract, so to speak. Yeah,
exactly.
I was gonna say I had a similar experience where I don't know, that there's a lot of interesting stories, and we'll get into some of the interesting findings as well, because there is some cool things that you don't really think about when you think of athletic success in specific sports, such as why do Kenyan runners seem to have like a sort of monopoly on marathon or long distance running, for example. And it turns out there's obviously genetic factors, but also like physiological factors that affect that, as well as, we talk about the balance between nature and nurture, so to speak, as well. I mean, a lot of this book, in the name Sports Gene, does take a very genetic approach, and then talks about very specific examples of the genes that affect performance in certain sports. But there is also a few chapters, especially early on in the book, which we'll talk about in a minute, which were a lot around sort of the nurture side of things, and that we can actually learn sport specific skills, so to speak, which I think as a generalization, these apply more to sports where there's like a mental component with the sport, rather than obviously just, in my head, a purely physical component, such as when you're running. Because there is some, yes, like, I don't get me wrong, there is some skill to it. Like there's some skill in terms of like maybe running technique, etc. But there's less. For example, in the 100-meter sprint, right? You're not computing what other people are doing. You're not looking for like movements are coming at you. You're focusing solely, and then your body, your physiology directs you there as quick as possible, right? And that's where the sort of the genetic component kind of comes in more. Which I guess you could argue then gives people some hope that some of these other sports, which are, I guess you could say, such as like football, American football, etc., basketball, and although we'll get onto that one later, have a more nurture based, or have the option for nurturing and which you could become better at. But
I was just thinking it's obvious, but I've never thought of like sprinting as like the quickest sport. As in, it's literally just 10 seconds, right? Like, there's no time to even think about anything when you're doing it.
I didn't realize there was a 60 meters. He talks about
is there?
There's like a 60
there
meters,
is. Yeah, there is.
And he says that basically Usain Bolt wouldn't win a 60 meters because he takes a while to get into his stride. Yeah. And that therefore, to be better at that, this is another good point. So obviously different sports require different sort of physiologies to be good at. Yeah. And one of the ones for the 60 meters, I believe, was like short legs, because you can do more steps within that time frame of 60 meters or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's just quite interesting. And then I'm getting ahead of myself here, but what I found interesting as well was when he talks about the best performers in certain sports all share that. So sports, specific sports like Olympic running, so sports which require less skill, all tend to have the same body type, which I thought was super interesting. I don't know if you extract that from the book, where he's like, the difference between elite Olympic sprinters in their body types is like negligible. in comparison to the difference between them and the general population.
Exactly.
So basically, the sport selects the body type to an extent, which will
And
we'll
I guess on that note, like one thing that will actually probably come in handy. So there's a thing called gene environment correlation, and essentially it's like how your genes or how your environment affects your genes, right? And so there are 3 types. So there's passive, evocative, and I think it's direct. Passive is kind of like, you've your genes have been passed on by your parents, and your genes naturally like make you choose and make certain decisions in your environment, right? And so they would have chosen their environment, and then they had you, and you have some of those genes, and so some of those genes correspond well with your environment because you're in their environment, which they chose based on their genes, if that makes sense.
Okay, I got you. Yeah.
Then there's evocative, and the idea is that your genes evoke a response in others, right? So if I had genes responsible for antisocial behavior and I went to then people might try to avoid me, right?
Yeah, okay.
Because of that, I might make other decisions, other risky behavior decisions based on those reactions, right? So it's kind of evoking that behavior. And now direct gene environment correlation is you actively choosing decisions which are kind of based on your genes, right? And so I guess if you could probably apply this a lot to sport, whereby you seem to excel at something, and so then you decide to go and to follow that route, right? You just you're doing well in it, so you decide, okay, I'm good at running, I'm going to sign up for the sports team or for athletics. And that kind of like helps, I guess, a bit, just getting a bit of a more substance to like how our environment and gene kind of interact with one another.
Yeah. Just a quick one as well. Does any of that relate to epigenetics?
So it kind of is, yeah. Epigenetics is actually, so there's gene environment correlation and then gene environment interaction. They're two kind of
because that's epigenetics is where your genes are slightly changed based upon the environment you're in, which you then give to your kids, right? Or like you then pass on potentially as like a genetic memory sort of thing.
Yeah, so they're like epigenetic tags, and so you have gene environment correlation, gene environment interaction. They're kind of like two little sub-disciplines, I guess. And then in gene environment interaction, you have epigenetics, and that's literally how the environment changes how your genes are expressed. Okay. And then those tags can be passed on.
Yeah, I don't think there was anything in this book about epigenetics, but be interesting. It'd be interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. So we'll jump into it. So as we just sort of introduced, this book is all around the difference between nature and nurture and athletic performance. And it takes a very strong-sided approach in my head towards the genetic side of things, especially on Olympic-based sports or sports requiring a archetypal or like specific body type. I mean, obviously once a specific body type is preferred in a sport, all of a sudden you're going to get, genetics play more of a role in this than others.
Yeah.
But yeah, as we shall see, so the first chapter is called Beat by an Underhand Girl. And I thought this was quite interesting. The story of these so-called baseball stars, and I can't remember any of their names, but the synopsis of the story was these guys can hit, baseball's being thrown at them at like 100 miles per hour, right? And then they had a girl who came and underhanded it to them at 68 miles per hour, and they could not hit any of her, what do they call it when you throw in baseball? I'm going to, like, for the American audience, they're going to hate
pitches.
Yeah, pitches. So they couldn't hit any of the girls' pitches. And the reasoning behind it is they talk that baseball players, they don't actually have time to follow the ball all the way towards their bat. So they're sort of predicting based upon where the person throws it, where the ball's going to end up before it even gets their bat right. So they're already swinging in advance. And because this ball is coming so slow at them, it completely throws off the predictions they're used to, and they can't hit the ball. Yeah. And I thought it's quite interesting because they've taken this insight, and it wasn't in this book, but they've taken this insight into cricket practice because they realize that training with a bowling machine, for example, as well, where you don't actually have the cues of the person's hand to give you the predictive ability to where the ball's going to be, you then end up training yourself for the wrong thing. Because if you spend, for example, in cricket, I don't know if anybody's used a cricket bowling machine, but it's a big machine which has a circle in the middle and it shoots out a ball, but it's nothing like a natural person coming in and bowling, where they're moving their hands, they've got different body positions, their arms coming in at different angles, which is what people use for their predictive capability to then hit the ball. So by training in that in that way, you then end up sort of shooting yourself in the foot for performance days. But I just thought that whole chapter on that was just fascinating. This idea that they're not even seeing the ball to the bat. They're predicting where it's going based upon small cues in a body or in the action of the person who's pitching and reacting to that.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting, because you would assume, right, before he even spoke about predicting where the ball was going to be, it's going to be based on reaction times. But he was literally saying the time with which it takes the ball to leave the pitcher's hand and to be hit is so short, and our biology, our bodily systems, don't take, it'll take, what was it? Takes a certain amount of time that it wouldn't be able to program all of that and then just react. It would have to be able to predict. And that's what they were saying. That's what he was saying, that we get better and better with more and more experience at predicting certain things to do with whatever sport we're playing. And I think they did a bunch of different studies showing a picture of a pitcher's arm, right? Not even holding the ball, their forearm or something in a particular position is just literally flashed at them for milliseconds, and then the sportsman could say, oh yeah, it's going to land here, it's going to be a curveball, it's going to be this kind of ball, and it just comes with more and more experience. And so that predictive element is really, that is the nurture aspect, that you basically hone that with more and more experience. I thought it was really interesting. Actually,
I thought it was really interesting as well, because it doesn't just apply to what you're saying there, which is with the sort of one-on-one sports where the person, you see the angle that they're going to throw the ball, for example, but it also works with positioning in sports as well. So they were talking about, I think, volleyball as well, where they flash, like you said, they flash a picture for a millisecond of a volleyball match scenario, right? And the difference between somebody who doesn't play volleyball and volleyball is so stark, because the person who plays volleyball knows exactly what's happening in the game from that 1 second sort of showing of a picture. And I think what was really interesting is he had this idea. So what was once a mere blink of light for one player had turned into a fully formed narrative for the other. And what he means by that is the person's already played out from that one instance what's going to happen in the future, and obviously predicted it, and therefore knows more of what to do next, or has been conditioned to react in a certain way to that scenario, right? And that's where this idea of skill comes into sport, because over time you condition yourself to react to specific moves, plays, positions of bodies, etc., which aid you in, it depends on the sport, either hitting the ball, getting yourself back into a defensive position. If you're attacking somebody, let's just say in football, you see their body goes to the left, you now know you can dribble past them to the right. All that sort of stuff is applied based upon this conditioning through, I guess, what you could say is experience, right?
No, exactly. It's and I think there probably is a genetic aspect to it, or a biological aspect to it, whereby because he was talking about for the time it takes for light or a picture to go to the back of our retinas, to be flipped, to be sent to the brain, to be processed, all takes a certain amount of time. And there probably are some people who do that quicker than others, but I think he was kind of just emphasizing the point that doesn't really explain why some people are really good at sport. Essentially, that comes from all this acquired experience that hones that kind of predictive ability that allows them to react faster.
He then went on to talking about chess grandmasters. So rather than obviously the sporting side of things, is chess a sport?
I think it technically is a sport.
Is it classified as a sport?
I think it is.
But I think so. There was an experiment done by Debrief, and I can't remember if he's referenced later on. I think he might be as well, where he's comparing a grandmaster, world champion, a master, and a city champion with an average club player. And basically, they did the same sort of test. So this is called the occlusion test, I believe, where they flash a specific scenario to you, and depending on how trained you are, you react differently to the scenario. So the one they did here, I believe, was they flashed a chessboard to these players. So in the 4 trials, the grandmaster recreated
chess game.
chess game yet. Recreated an entire board after viewing it. After viewing it for 3 seconds, the master was able to accomplish the same feat twice. Neither of the lesser players was able to reproduce any boards with complete accuracy. And overall, the grandmaster and master accurately replaced more than 90% of the pieces in the trials. So they could literally look at it for a snap second and remember where the pieces were.
Which is pretty fucking cool.
But the point here as well wasn't they have like superior memory. It was the fact that they've memorized positions on a board that they've seen before, so they chunk the information down. A bit like I think we talked about this ages ago in what was the book called? The one with chunking and
for numbers.
I think it is that. It's Barbara Oakley.
Yeah.
This idea of they've managed to chunk the board down because they know where specific pieces can be and can't be.
Yeah.
And I thought that was super interesting, and that, in a weird way as well, it was like predictive of their like level of chess. The ability to do this was based upon their level of like chess mastery, which just goes to show that that's how you get to that level of chess mastery. You have such a good perception of the board that you can see something in a millisecond and 90% represent it in your mind. It's crazy, absolutely crazy.
That is so cool, I think.
Oh, I mean, it's cool, right? It's like a superpower to a degree, right? Like compared to what was it as well? So the city champion manager, the club player could only remember about 50% of the board. Yeah,
that's good.
But I just thought that was a really interesting example because it gave you a proper look into like a cross comparison of a master of something with an average player. And bearing in mind, this average player is probably like an average city player being like somebody who actually plays. So imagine doing them compared to somebody who never plays chess. Like they probably wouldn't, if they had the test done, they'd probably remember maybe just like 2 or 3 pieces at absolute best.
Yeah.
It's one of those things is where like you get to the best of your sport. What I've always found so interesting, like with, for example, football, because I like to play football, but I don't know anything about the actual tactics of it. But some people can just look at like a team and look at the way they're playing and just be like, I just know who's going to win this immediately.
Yeah.
So like these guys are out of position. This guy's not here. Like they're going to completely like throw them over because these guys are going to overlap. I've always respected that ability to just, see something. You see it in such a deeper and more analytical way than anybody else does. And like the average person who doesn't care and doesn't go into these details just would not even notice it, right? Like most people who go to football games don't go in there with like the tactical knowledge of these, of the people who actually spend their lives dissecting formations, tactics, strategies.
No, it's the same when like you see coaches of like professional sports athletes and they just see things straight away. Like I remember watching a tennis thing recently. I think it's called, is it Point Match or Point? I can't remember anyway. And it was like this guy who was, I think he was like the uncle of Rafael Nadal. And he just like could watch a game for like, a minute, and he knew like what was going on in like the player and like, how it was going to go. And obviously it's not fortune telling, but you do get better at being able to predict how people will perform. And I guess that is the kind of importance of having a coach who has so much experience, because they can see things that the player can't yet, right?
Yeah.
Hasn't learnt just yet.
Well, I guess this is why you'd almost say like, when they talk about really young, talented people, they're like, they're going to get better. I feel like they think the reason they think that is because they're like, they haven't got the experience yet to understand the tactics, the strategies, or the experience, like we're saying, to be able to memorize the chessboard like 90%, they're 50%, they're 60%, but they're not 90% there. But when they hit that, they're going to be, top of their game sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, learning is doing, isn't it?
Yeah.
As we like to say here at Wise Words. So should we go to this bit? That's how best to install the software.
Yes.
I think the concept that success in elite performance is based on learned skill rather than innate abilities gave rise to the most renowned theory in modern sports expertise, which does not acknowledge the role of genetics. In the paper titled The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance, the authors applied their conclusions to sports, referring to Janet Stark's occlusion tests, which demonstrated that learned perceptual expertise is more crucial than natural reaction abilities. They proposed that accumulated practice hours were often mistaken for inherent talent in both sports and music. Exactly what we were talking about, how you would assume that when they were talking about the baseball players, it was about reaction times and that's genetic, rather than actually this learnt ability to predict.
Mm-hmm.
Although he never referred to it as a rule, Anderson Erickson, and we've done Peak, haven't we?
Peak, we have done it, yes, for sure.
The lead author of the paper and a psychologist now at Florida State University became recognized as the originator of the 10,000 hours to expertise concept, which is often referred to as the deliberate practice framework by those who investigate skill acquisition. I remember when we were at school, they would, what's the name? The headmaster would go on about it.
Oh yeah, he did actually.
Every year, it was like at the beginning of the year, he was like, "Don't forget 10,000 hours," and it's not that simplistic.
It's
more
it's
like
funny because I can't wait to
hours,
into the I can't wait to get into the next chapter. We find out it doesn't actually work. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah, funny. God, it just takes you back. But yes, that's essentially. I think that's pretty famous, actually. I would say
it has been really famous. I think he talks about the fact that Malcolm Gladwell popularized it a little bit because he had a bigger, for example, Peaks it's probably a very popular book now, but I assume back then it wasn't that popular, and that Malcolm Gladwell, just because he is a more popular author, brought attention to that idea. Now everybody reads the original book. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, at the end of the day, I feel like with most things, it's a good ballpark generalization.
It is, yeah.
Rather than a concrete scientific rule. And the problem is, like we've discussed many times before, the moment you give something, a number, it gives it some sort of like scientific accuracy, and everybody just assumes, 10,000 hours and you're going to be a superstar, whatever it is. Yeah. But as we'll find out in the next chapter, so in chapter 2, A Tale of Two High Jumpers, or 10,000 hours plus or minus 10,000 hours, there was a bit at the beginning of the chapter where he talks about Dan McLaughlin, I believe his name is. Yeah. And this guy basically decided, or he'd read a bunch of the books like Peak and Malcolm Gladwell books. So I think actually Outliers, that's the book. Yeah, Outliers. And he basically decided that he wanted to, quit everything. I can't remember what his job originally was, but become a professional PGA golfer. So he basically said, I'm going to log as like a sort of scientific experiment and social experiment, I guess you could say, all my training in hours, and I'm going to do 10,000 hours, and I'm going to prove, or I believe this is true, so I'm going to become a professional golfer. And let me just double check it. I believe I did read this at the time. I don't think he made it.
No, I don't think he did he? But he was kind of like, regardless, it's now something that I like.
Failure of the Dan Plan. I think it was quite recently as well. 2017 was when they wrote the farewell post. Because he didn't basically make it. So this is where we have to look at it and say, like, as a rough goalpost, like first of all, it's a very good idea to put in hours of practice, as we've now decided with this, especially with sports related sort of prediction based skills. The practice is going to help, right? Yeah. It's not going to make you worse. So obviously it's worth doing if your goal is to become a famous or professional sportsman, or, hit the peak abilities. But it just goes to show it's not like an ironclad rule that, if you do the 10,000 hours, you can do anything you want, right? Yeah. And I do think there's a level of like wishful thinking that all of humanity has, which is, if I put in the grind, I can be anything I want to be. And then this book kind of then puts you back in your place a little bit and goes, yes, you can. But there are specific biological, like physiological things in specific sports that you need to stand a better chance at being good at something, or being the best at something, right? Like, there's no doubt that, if you put 10,000 hours into playing football, right, you're going to be better than somebody who's done 0 hours. You're going to be better than that. But whether or not you're going to be the best of the best and competing with the other people who've put 10,000 hours practice in is another question.
Exactly.
And I think this is where people get a bit confused by it.
And he kept on giving the example of like pygmies.
Oh yes, he did. He was bullying them a little bit, wasn't he?
He's like, I mean, like,
about 4 times.
You might, he literally did bring it up so many times. It's like, you could get a basketball player who's a pygmy, but most likely they're not going to be. Essentially, they could be good at basketball, but they'll still be at a disadvantage for being shorter than 5 foot. Bless those pygmies.
Yeah, bless them. So yeah, I thought I made an interesting note here about the problem with the 10,000 hours rule and the difference between cross-sectional or retrospective studies and longitudinal studies. And I took this note mainly for myself because I wanted to know the difference. So all the evidence that supported the 10,000 hours rule has been cross-sectional or retrospective, which is biased against discovering innate talent because they're looking back retrospectively of the people who've, become famous and or gone on to be very successful at what they do, right? Or like are experts at piano, for example.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly as well, a lot of the studies that went into this 10,000 hour rule as well was kind of based upon asking them like, how many hours did you do? And they're like, oh, I did a lot. And it's like, okay, well, you weren't timing it right.
Yeah.
You weren't like measuring it. Like I wouldn't even be able to tell you how many hours I spent doing specific things if you asked me. I could say to you I've done a lot, but I wouldn't know.
And also, what's the measure of deliberate?
Right? Yes, no, true. No, also, yeah, that's a good point actually, because
that would be subjective, I'm assuming, right? To a degree,
of course,
or how much you learn, how many insights you get.
I wonder, kind of on a side note, did you play an instrument back at school? Can't remember.
No, I didn't.
Because I used to play piano and I remember like hating practicing. And I'm wondering whether it's because there was never really a goal in sight for me. There was never like a goal for my practice. It wasn't like, I'm going to learn this song. I just sit there and just play a song because practice became synonymous with just doing it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah.
But there was no like in my head goal that I was aiming towards. I wasn't even doing the grade exams, whatever you called them at music.
Yeah.
It became a bit of like a pain.
I was the same. Like I started and stopped like 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
And I just if you don't
have
then
you
didn't
have like the sophistication, right? To did you? I guess you did. But I guess no, because other people kind of set the goals to you as well. Like your schooling goals were kind of set to everybody. Everybody had schooling goals related to grades, right? Like you couldn't get away from them. But when it came to self-setting goals, I felt like back then it was something that we weren't developed to do, maybe so to speak, or like maybe as young children you're less developed to set your own goals.
That's an interesting point.
But yeah, sorry, back to the book. So the longitudinal study is basically what happened with Dan McLaughlin, where it's like following his progression and tracking the hours accumulated of practice towards it. And what I thought was really interesting, because they did another study. So in 2007, psychologists Compensatory and Gobet conducted a study of 104 competitive chess players and found that. And so this was a longitudinal study. They were following them and found that 10,000 hours was close to the amount of practice needed to attain master status. But the range, this is the kicker, the range of hours needed varied greatly between individuals. So one player reached the level of master in 3,000 hours, and then another needed 23,000 hours. And then there was several players who started in childhood and logged over 25,000 hours and never got to master status.
God, like that.
It just goes to show there's variability within the training, right? Like
exactly.
And this is where talent comes in. Like when somebody goes, oh, he's super talented. It's like you're basically by proxy saying his ability to pick up the sport has been amazing, or the ability to pick up the skill is great,
Yeah. And once again, like there's variability in whether that's because of genetic factors or how they trained or how they so once again, it's still hard to pick away, disentangle. It's quite easy to say, well, the person who did 3,000 hours of chess, they must just be like born to do it. But then once again, maybe their way of practicing chess or something is completely different to the people who did 25,000 hours, and maybe they reaped more of it. So there's always both at play, essentially.
Yeah.
And
then the next part of the chapter, I think I did message you about it before, is the cross comparison of Stefan Holm, I believe, who's a high jumper, and I can't remember where he's from. I want to say like Norway or something. 1 second.
Yeah. Was it Denmark or Norway?
It could be. I'm going to butcher it, so I'm going to put it in just to double check. He was Swedish. There you go. I'm
Swedish. There we go.
Swedish. And he was a deliberate practice, sort of like disciple, master, whatever you want to call it, where he's put so many hours into developing his high jump. And basically in the book, they cross-compared it to a guy called Donald Thomas, who basically, within about, I think, what was it, less than a year of serious practice, he kind of came into the Olympic scene and I believe beat
he did.
Stefan Holm.
Yeah, he did.
Basically proving that, even if you put 20,000 hours of practice, somebody's got like a sort of genetic or physiological advantage and they come into the sport,
Yeah.
And they pick it up quicker than you, they can beat you.
In
And
which
I
case,
thought-
in this case, he did, didn't he? I think he had
Yeah.
like some really long Achilles heel, which allowed him to jump really high in comparison to the others. So not only was, what's his name? Stefan Holm was like shorter in comparison to like the average high jumper, but also, this other high jumper, what's his name?
Donald Thomas.
Donald Thomas was much taller and had a much
that was it.
like a ridiculously long Achilles tendon.
8 months of high jump practice, and he managed to come along. But okay, so this is where I got really interested in this when I was doing. I don't know if you saw my note I put here, like what the book failed to mention, and I found this on a Cura. So take this also with a grain of salt, because I didn't fact check the Cura response. But at the age of around 22, Donald Thomas began his high jumping career. But he'd been jumping since he was 5 years old, mainly for his passion of basketball. So as basketball players tend to play a lot and jump frequently during games, Thomas had already accumulated a significant amount of jumping experience. Because in the book, he doesn't mention, he kind of makes it out like, he was never doing high jumping.
Yeah.
And then he just suddenly became good at jumping.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
The actual context was this guy was actually playing a lot of basketball, and to be fair, it makes sense because I think he was pretty tall as well. And as you find out, that is a prerequisite to being a basketball player. So he's been jumping since a young age. So you could say maybe he wasn't training specific skills related to the high jump in the sense of the specific body shape you need to jump over the bar. Yeah, but he was training his jumping ability throughout, his whole kid years by playing basketball. Yeah. So,
I think also just an interesting point that I found in the book on that is that they said that after Donald Thomas won, I think, was it gold at the Olympics or something for that? He didn't improve.
Yeah.
He just stayed the same. He was stagnant. So it's like almost that ability, his tendon, his Achilles tendon had got him so far. And, his, like you just said, his previous kind of basketball experience, but there was no deliberate practice or not much deliberate practice in terms of high jumping. And so he just didn't excel.
Yeah. And if my read of the book was correct, I don't know where he said it. He didn't say it specifically, right? But I remember him being reluctant towards the high jump as well. Like it wasn't something he actually cared about, Yeah. It's kind of one of those things that they spotted him and they were like, you're really good at this. And then he found himself like fast tracked to the world championships and then won it. Yeah. But I got the feeling that he didn't give a shit, like, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that, if you remember, there's a part in the book where the dad of Stefan goes really mental, saying like, I can't believe this guy's just come off and he doesn't jump properly and stuff. To me, that almost also stinks a bit of this guy had an attitude when he came, maybe because he was like so lazy, like laid back and didn't give a fuck and just but it goes to show arguing why he never improved further. I mean, obviously there's going to be a limitation to what we can all achieve as like a high jump physiologically. Like you're never going to get to the point where you can jump a skyscraper, you would hope.
And also you're never going to find other people that have exactly the same kind of biology and past experience, right? Like the categories that we break it down to are male and female. And so there's still loads of variability within that. And so like, if Stefan Holm had done all this practice, had a really long Achilles tendon and, was 6'5", then I'm sure, he probably would have been able to excel even further. But that's just how I guess sports go.
Yeah. And then we got, does practice matter? So that was just talking about, that was a note just talking about, does practice matter? And I mean, as we can see from Stefan Holm's sort of rise to fame, so to speak, when we were saying he was obviously too short or shorter than the average person, it goes to show that obviously some level of practice does help. Although I do believe, if correct, he did have an extremely long Achilles as well. So he didn't have as long as Donald Thomas, but they both, like we were saying earlier, where the sport like selects the physiology, so to speak. Everybody who does high jump has a really long Achilles, which helps for the spring of the jump. So then we move on to the chapter 3, which is Major League Vision and the greatest child athlete sample ever, the hardware and software paradigm. And this one was quite interesting because now he starts talking about how genetics and the hardware of your body, not just the learning, actually play a role. And he was using, I think, depth perception with with baseball players. So like obviously beforehand we were just talking about obviously predictive ability being a big key component, but here he actually started talking as well about the ability to see the seam. I don't know if you got this from this chapter.
Vaguely,
the seam was spinning in a specific way. So if you had a really good depth perception, you could pick up on the seam, which is funny because once again, that the picking up of the seam allows you to get a better register of the software side of things. So like the development of the predictive, like the ability to predict is based on that. If you can see more when it comes out of the hand, for example, you can then predict better. So this is where the two meet. And he's basically saying, obviously this is skill related, but people who have that amazing, like apparently the best batters have this level of sight, which is better than most people. And then
2015, wasn't it, or something like that?
Yeah, something disgusting. And they basically went on to say that there's a guy, for instance, called Louis Rosenbaum, who was able to predict straight 2 rookies of the year using visual hardware tests by basically being able to be like, so obviously he's looking at a subsector of the people who've developed the skills. But then he's gone, these two have got great vision and they've got the skills, as a winning sort of partnership. And it just goes to show once again that it is a bit of both. There's, the skill related, but the hardware can help you with the skill related, right? And the next part was quite interesting as well. About this was a longitudinal study done by Groningen Talent, and it's to do with football in the Netherlands. And they basically found out that the most important thing with football was the amount of time you were training. But slow players never got fast.
That was really interesting, actually.
Their point was, like you can still become a professional footballer, and one of the most important things about it is the time spent. And obviously we know that because it's not just about your physicality in football. Like it helps, but being able to read the game also helps. But then his next point was like, if you want to be like a winger, let's just say, and you need to be fast, if you're not fast, you're not going to be able to train your way out of that. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Your hardware essentially determines how much potential or how much software you can learn, right? I just thought that was really interesting. If you were slow, you're really not going to get that much faster. Like, I mean, it makes sense, but it's also, I think we hate being told these kind of things. We love the idea that we can always improve, but in a way
we love the idea of unlimited potential, which I think is why the 10,000 hours went down so well. Like in public, like mind, it's like, we love the idea that the only thing separating us from like our dreams is hard work and effort, because we can achieve whatever we want if we put our mind to it, that kind of phrase. Like, yes, you can definitely get better at the things you're setting yourself to be better at. But from what this book basically says is like, if you want to beat the best at certain things, physiology is going to come into it. And he kind of says a little bit like, you should take a cold hard look at yourself and think, if my body isn't best prepared for this specific sport, is it worth, like, if your goal is just to be beating yourself and progressively getting better at something, and the only person you're trying to beat is you, go for it.
They're fun, absolutely.
But if you're trying to be like an Olympic champion at something which you're physiologically not, I guess, specified for, not have the advantage of being for a specific sport, then then kind of like, think about it twice. Don't waste too much of your time trying to pursue something that you might be, I guess you could even argue, disadvantaged. Because just by having a body type that is an advantage, you are disadvantaged, and therefore is going to require more work.
And you're also talking about like the tiniest percentage of people who go to the Olympics. Like who actually compete in these sports is the tiniest percentage. And so already you need to be excelling to be able to get to that, and then to be able to win out of all of those people in that particular sport. It needs. You're looking for every last bit that will help you improve.
We're talking about the best in the world here, but most people's goals aren't the best in the world, is it? So like, this isn't to shoot yourself. Like, if you love running and you're not built for like sprinting, or like, you love sprinting, you're not built for sprinting. Let's just say, because I don't know, you're like, I guess his argument is depending on the length you're running, the height. But let's just say you're just not built for sprinting. You still can sprint. You can still improve. Like there's nothing in this book which says you can't make improvements, right? It's just like, if your goal is to be the best, then you're going to struggle against people who have advantages, and that's basically it. It's like, it's not to like shit on everybody who's got a dream of being great at something, great at a specific skill. Like you can be great, you can be better than 90%,
90%, yeah, exactly,
but you're not going to get to that sort of 99 percentile where you're like the top. And then I got this other note about the specializing late, which I thought was quite interesting. This idea that specializing early, so specializing in a specific sport early actually causes more chance of repetitive like strain injury and stuff. And basically his argument or the study, whatever they were, in fact, I think it's a study, let me just double check. Yeah, it's a literature review. And they were saying that it's actually best to build an athletic base first. And what they find with a lot of famous sports people is they tend to just be really good at every sport, right? And then they specialize afterwards, because I think you talk about this so many times before with like the idea of practicing movement patterns having a solid base of athleticism before you specialize in a sport, because you've then mastered all different directions you can throw your body in, which will actually help you in whatever sport you're going to do. Because your sport, no matter what sport it is, it's still going to require a level of athleticism. Even if they have specific moves they use more, having a solid base in all directions is going to be, advantageous, so to speak. And you're developing other skills, right? Like,
absolutely. I've just started reading that Ross Edgley's book, and it's one of his points. And it's something that apparently the Russians started. This idea of like, you need to really start. You need to build a big foundation. And they started this thing, I think it was called like General Physical Preparedness Scheme or something like that, where they would literally get children, they would like, make them do like strength, power, speed, all these different things. So you're building this foundation, because then you can start to specialize, right? And also I would assume that doing that and getting that experience starts to naturally show where you are better at. Right. Let's say if I haven't done anything before and I just choose a sport, well, how do I know that sport's good for me? Whereas if I do a bunch of different, if I work on a bunch of different things to do with physical activity, physical fitness, and then I start to realize, well, I'm much better at speed, well, then maybe that will point me in that direction, be like, okay, well, maybe I'm built for speed, or maybe I excel at this. So it's a good point.
I think it's a good one as well for like when, let's just say it's less about the physical side, like Olympics-based sports, and it's more maybe team-based sports, learning how to, the skills which you don't necessarily think of, but like teamwork, communication, all that sort of stuff, which requires team, like a team to learn, right? Doing different sports actually helps you with that, so to speak. Because I just realized there's a lack of this book in terms of like these more like social skills, because obviously in some athletic performances that's super important, like communication ability to like
absolutely
and being a team player, so to speak, and like mindset and stuff like that. So to end that chapter, I've got this idea that genetic advantages do exist, despite what we might want to believe. And then he talks about this idea that even the word genetics now has become taboo. So they changed their languages to like molecular biology and protein synthesis to avoid mentioning genetics. I thought it was quite interesting.
That's so ridiculous that we kind of, and he echoes this through the book by saying like, oh, I wouldn't be able, like researchers saying, oh, I wouldn't be able to get funding for that, because it would just show that certain people with certain like backgrounds or ethnicities would have an advantage or disadvantage in a sport, right? Like as if we're like, we've come so low that we have to compare, and like our value is based on like how well we do in a sport.
No, but it's not even that, is it? It's just it's like it's deeper than that. It's like you can't show that anybody has an advantage in anything.
I know, but it's
like you can't, like it doesn't even matter about race or ethnicity. It's like nobody can have an advantage. We're all equal. It's like, we all have like equal rights, but like tell that to somebody who's like 6'8" and you're playing basketball against them and you're 5'2". And who's going to do a slam dunk? Like,
no, exactly.
Okay, get the ladder out then. Okay, like fantastic.
Yeah, we all know it, but yet we just don't say it. But no,
I thought the next chapter, so the chapter 4, why men have nipples.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go into the beginning bit because I don't know the reasoning behind it well enough. But basically, my grasp of it was what we believe to be gender based, or like the detection of what gender you are, is actually more complicated than just the two chromosomes we believe. There's some people who have like this, I can't remember what's the name of it, something like de la Chapelle syndrome or something, where they have like abnormal genitalia or something, where like they can have female genitals, but they have the masculine, like the testosterone flowing through them, like a male. Yeah, where they're technically by definition, or the definitions has been set, not a man, but they have the building blocks of a man.
Yeah.
And therefore, to be honest, I've never really, obviously I've seen these debates where, you see like a female swimmer who is built like a man, who just absolutely destroys everybody. And I've always had like an opinion on that, but I've never actually looked into it. But it actually looks a lot more difficult to decide what a female and man is than what we originally believed. Yeah. And I just thought that was an interesting side note, because I'd have to look into it more now to have an opinion on it.
And I think what was quite interesting, like I didn't know a lot about this, but a lot of it is based on like testosterone levels, essentially. Testosterone, I think, helps a lot in like in physical activity. And the Olympic Committee, there's been occasions where people in a particular, whether male or female, have really excelled way above others in their same cohort. And so it strikes it like as pretty odd why they're excelling so much. And there was an example, I can't remember who the woman was. I think she a runner or a marathon runner? I can't remember, but anyway, she was like doing really. Sorry,
it's not Paula Radcliffe, is it?
That might be it. Is that
was it actually her? Because she was like. Anyway, continue your story, and I'll see if I can remember if it was her or not.
But essentially, she had this like really high testosterone levels, I think, and they did this test, and it was something to do with like her being labeled as not being a woman, and so she was discredited. And then it was only after that they were doing these tests, and this person came out. Was it De La Chapelle? I can't remember. And they were saying like, actually, it's a lot more complex figuring out, whether someone's a male or female, because a lot of the genes can kind of overlap. And so she was, awarded it. And so now, like, apparently it's like a part of the whole Olympic Committee thing, where if someone is doing too well in their category, then they're tested in this like in-depth way to see whether, you are.
It's an interesting one as well, because I guess if they then were put into the male bracket, they would have not a weakness, but they'd be slightly disadvantaged because they don't have the full blown, testosterone. Like, if my understanding was, it was like a elevated for a female, but obviously not as elevated as a man, or maybe it is. But you could argue they might be disadvantaged. I don't actually know what times they're putting up, so I wouldn't know if they're like close to what the male threshold is for like a specific sport, right? Because if they're in the Olympic threshold, then you're like, okay, fine, they can compete with the males. But otherwise, you have to create, I guess, this second, like this other. Do you know what I mean? This is where it gets all complicated and political. Is like, is there like a third gender you could create, which is like a mix kind of thing? It's all very like, I don't know. Yeah,
but this is going back to what I was saying earlier on, is in like, you'll never be able to compete against someone with the same exact genetic genes unless you've got an identical twin, right? Yeah. And so, we've categorized people based on male and female because that represents 99.9% of the people who are competing. Yeah. And then just now and then there will be people with certain genes that really help them to excel in whatever sport they're doing above and beyond the others. And it kind of reflects what someone of the other gender might do.
Yeah. I guess the interesting part about this is like, eventually it could get to the point where they're testing you not even on gender, but on like your bodily, how well adapted your body is to this specific sport. You'd be like, you have this much hemoglobin, therefore you're in this hemoglobin like section of competition, But obviously that would just take too long to test everybody. Like, it's not really practical, but you could technically define the barriers for competition like that, because then you'd be finding the people who are in that genetic area who've worked the hardest, so to speak, or trained the hardest to be the best kind of thing.
But then you'd have to break it down on like, but then you'd have to break it down onto like, well, what genes contribute the most, which ones are more important than others. There's probably like,
it's not as
we know,
it's just like one, right?
Yeah.
It's not just like,
there are thousands of genes responsible for like one trait, right? So or hundreds of genes
they
that are
have
responsible. So
and they have complex interactions, right? Like you change one, then all of a sudden it doesn't react the same way. It's like they all react with each other. So you can't just like remove one or change one and it all works, like hunky dory or whatever.
Exactly.
But yeah, I just thought that was like an interesting part. It did open my eyes a little bit to the sort of the problems of the genderization in sport. And then the next note I got in this chapter was about the genetic trainability advantages. So to summarize it, it talked about that different people have different responses to exercising. Two people can do the same VO2 max test, and then somebody the next time performs way better than the other one, which shows that they've adapted to it differently. And obviously there's many different factors to that. There's, genetics, there's also nutrition, there's recovery time. There's, once you start really looking into it, there's so many different factors that can come in. But the point being is some people respond to specific types of training quicker than others. I believe it was this book. He did talk about him and a friend I think he had at one point when he was training when he was younger, and he talked about how he diagnosed himself with slower development. So like his body responds well to training, but over a long period of time. And his friend was somebody who's a bit more of like a instant like progression, then really slow. Yeah, and then he basically said that his friend ended up whittling out and not really competing because he didn't get any improvement after his first initial amount, and he was always constantly, slowly getting there. And that maintained his motivation, which is, it kind of made this point to me that sometimes maybe it'd be useful to know which one you are, right? Because if you're somebody who responds really quick to training, you should know that you've almost peaked, right? You should do your training and be like, fuck me up, I've done really well here. I should set my expectations now to know that I'm not going to keep making the same level of gains that I just did the first time. So then you at least don't get disheartened when your progress is slow. And obviously then for the people who are slow progressors, but they always progress, or not always progress, but they progress consistently, just knowing that, fine, not every week I'm going to beat myself, but over like 2 months, I'm going to be way higher than I was like now. It would help you at least with motivation, because you'd be like, absolutely, I'm going to stay the course. But I thought that was interesting.
I thought it was really interesting, actually. I'd never heard of that term, or that concept of people starting really well but not being able to respond very well to training, and then vice versa.
And this applies to not just I guess it applies to also like muscle groups as well. Like he talks about like high responders for like specific muscle groups, which is just interesting because it basically brings up this point that I think I wrote it down here. There's no one size fits all training program. A lot of it is trial and error. It's like figure out, do something, do the exercise, do the training, do it consistently, see if you're making improvements. If you're not doing fast enough improvements, change it up a little bit and see if you can hit the same thing in a different way or whatnot. And I thought that's quite interesting. It's
really interesting, actually, that on like the muscle groups, because I've always noticed that some people just have a muscle group that grows really quickly. They don't need to do much, right? Or like,
it's the classic calves, isn't it? Some people just have massive.
Some people
calves.
have really fucking big calves.
And you're just like, how have you done that? And they don't even like exercise them. And you're just like, oh my god. I have bloody chicken drumstick legs. I need to, I have to do 1 million calf raises. Increase it by a centimeter.
It's interesting. And just like the slight stimulation, and they're fine. And then other things they really struggle at.
For sure. And then the next part I got here, which was really interesting, was this idea of testing identical twins. And basically tested identical twins in the same sort of fat life way as before. So they were measuring a VO2 max, I believe, and they were comparing them with other brothers, so people who were still related. And I believe the finding was that there was a massive amount of variability within pairs of brothers. I think it was something, what did I write down here? Was so the range of response to training was 6 to 9 times larger between pairs of brothers than within identical twins. So what they found out was identical twins had a very similar response pattern to specific stimuli. So there is a massive a massive genetic contribution to how you respond to exercise, or how your body responds to specific stimulus, which is interesting.
I don't think I've really ever thought about there being a biological reaction to the way that you train, right? Or some people are better responders.
But
because I
it's
wonder what
interesting,
that actual mechanism is, right? Like I'm trying to think.
But
now,
it depends. It depends what it is, right? So, for example, I think later on, I did make the notes on it. I don't know where it is, but it talks about this idea of satellite cells and muscles, and people with higher amounts of satellite cells or something like this are more susceptible to muscle growth with weight training, so to speak, right?
I remember Andy Galpin was talking a bit about that as well.
Yeah, and then obviously you got the myostatin thing we talked about with like myostatin cows. So if anybody's listening now, just Google myostatin cows. You see the most ripped cows you've ever seen in your life.
Huge. What is it? The Belgian Blues or something?
Oh, something like that. Yeah. But obviously the point with that one as well is like you don't. I think you have myostatin. I think, which basically means you don't have a limit to the amount of muscle you can grow.
Yeah.
But these are like, once again, these are factors that you either have or you don't, right? It's once again, it still doesn't take away from the fact that, if you're, in fact, I was saying that actually, I remember in the muscle part, they did talk a lot about some people who went through a lot of training and got like zero gains. And I was a bit like, oh my God, can you imagine that? Like, I have to say, I'm not happy with the speed at which I personally gain mass as well. But I also do wonder whether that's either genetic or nutrition based. You get what I mean? Like, am I eating enough, for example?
That.
But I feel like but I also do feel like we all have this like massive, I think just based on like the marketing stuff and stuff you see online, gives you this false representation of like 6-pack in 6 weeks, ripped in 6 weeks. You can be doing this shit for like years. It takes you that long to build up a decent, body. It's one of those things that you have to sort of, prepare yourself mentally for, I guess, in a way. It's like the expectations is like, for example, I can't just train for a year now and then, be a top marathon runner. I'd have to spend, and also bearing in mind, I'm getting to the age now where like everything goes downhill. So I should have had
your knees are going.
Well, no, not that far. But it's not going to take a year to be in that bracket. It's going to take years and years of practice and like dedicated training to hit these levels. But no matter what responder you are. And then the very last note I got here was this idea of starting at an elite level, which I thought was crazy. How they can literally, some people, they can just pull off the street and get them to do like a VO2 run. I thought we were doing quite well with our sort of 12-minute Cooper runs, like our 5Ks or whatever. And the fact that you can just, some people you just put off the street and they can just do it, it's quite embarrassing, really, isn't it?
It's just, I hate it. It's just, like you put an effort and other people just don't have to do that. But God.
But that's an example once again of the sort of like, genetic component to it, where somebody can literally be tested for a VO2 max, which is seen as like the gold standard for your ability to convert oxygen into energy. And like obviously the higher VO2 max is, the more energy you can use with oxygen. You can run faster, I guess, in a certain amount of time, right? And some people can just, untrained have an elite level. Like they were even saying like an Olympic level, as if sort of like the level that people get to with, years of training. Some people can just walk off the street. Although I would love to see, obviously he says this, but I would love to see what their background is, right? Like it could be one of those things where they claim they don't do exercise, but actually they're physical all the time. They're doing some form of activity, right? I wouldn't thought somebody who could just sit on the couch, just do nothing all day for like 5-10 years would then have a VO2 max of whatever. So there needs to be some context to this, because I feel like he didn't provide that. A bit like with the Donald Thomas. Oh yeah, he just randomly started jumping, but actually he'd been jumping all his life because he was a basketball
player.
There's
no context there. Absolutely. No, I think you're probably right there.
Chapter 6 is the super baby, bully whippets, and the trainability and muscle. So this is goes straight into the myostatin mutation. So what we were just talking about, this idea that I don't think anybody's been diagnosed with it.
No, I don't think it's very common in
human.
Yeah, I don't think it's very common.
I'm googling it now. Myostatin human images. They're claiming like they got pictures of bodybuilders, but
I think
either way,
he named one person, didn't he, that like responded in a way that he had loads of muscle, but actually it can lead to injuries later on in life, can't it? So like what we think of like, this ability to grow, I can't remember what it exactly was it something to do with your cap? There's no cap on how much muscle
there is. That's exactly it. There's no cap, and the reason why it's bad is obviously because muscle takes up a lot of energy, so you have to eat lots of calories, and it's not really, you're just not meant to be built like that, right? There's a reason why muscle's capped. And and it requires a lot of exercise and energy to build muscle, right?
And it's probably bad for your bones if you're not like gaining that muscle through engaging in physical activity, such as, let's say, weight training. Then your bones, there's a discrepancy in, you know, the muscle mass that you're gaining and the lack of like force going through your bones to make them improve in their strength. And so there's probably I reckon
there is I think there's a bit later on we talk about this idea of like the skeleton closet, and you can only be 5 times more heavier than your skeleton weight or something like that. But there is like an actual capacity to your skeleton. But yeah, this is just another proof that, you know, things are genetically decided. So, you know, the fact that they have this my-statin, which stops them from having a limit to muscle growth, and you just grow unlimited muscles, so to speak, proves, you know, they're going to probably be more muscly than you, right? Like, it's not really a competition if they have unlimited muscle growth. I mean, I say that tongue in cheek because it's not like they're going to balloon into the size of the universe, but they, you know, they get to the point where it's abnormal. And I do wonder whether those bodybuilders are actually, that's what they do. They have some sort of like myostatin creation mechanism with not just the steroids, the whatever they take, but they also have a thing which just lets them just grow even more. Think about it, like the combination of like anabolic steroids to like growing muscle, but then also removing the cap of muscle growth is like a cocktail for looking like a,
oh my god, like big Ronnie Coleman. Jesus Christ. Yeah, no, I reckon.
And then they all die with like heart attacks and really early because, you know, there's your body's not meant to be like that.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if then it's like, I know this gene contributes to, you know, putting having a lack of cap on your muscles, but then I wonder then if there's a spectrum, in which case, like, you know, for instance, I think Ronnie Coleman, who was like a Mr. Olympia or whatever, he was fucking huge and like a lot bigger than most of the other guys. And now, okay, it's probably down to training and pushing so much heavy weight, but, you know, like, he's had to have surgeries on his elbows and his knees and his hips and shit, and just looks in the worst possible shape. And I wonder if that's because, you know, he's just got so much muscle and he has the ability to grow muscle, but it's not really in, you know.
Yeah, I also wonder. So there's another book we're going to get onto in the future with the burn. I think it's like the book about metabolism and how we actually might have a certain amount of calories we can use per day. And if that is true, the argument could be when you have that many muscles, if all your energy is going towards muscle reparation, it's not going towards joints and all that sort of stuff, right? And you're going to have weaker joints, weaker heart, weaker whatever. You know, if there is such a level of like calorie restriction, like there's only a certain amount your body can process, let's just say, in a day, or like energy expenditure it can do, and it has to choose between what it chooses. And obviously, because you're putting it full of steroids and it's always going straight to the muscles, you then miss out on, you know, other elements. But yeah, that's just an idea.
That's a good point.
So yeah, the next part was all about how we gain muscle, and it talked a lot about individual differences in gene and satellite cell activity. So these factors, influence how we respond to weight training. And they did a study similar to the one before with the Heritage Family Study, and they basically just found out that some people muscle fibers within some people's muscle fibers in the study grew 50%, some grew 25%, some didn't grow at all. So it just goes to show, you know, the fact that this result even happened goes to show there's some variability in people's responses to this training, so to speak.
Which kind of brings up this next point, which is like the different fiber types. So coarsely speaking, muscle fibers come in 2 major types: slow twitch type 1 and fast twitch type 2. Fast twitch fibers contract at least twice as quickly as slow twitch fibers for explosive movements. The contraction speed of muscles has been shown to be a limiting factor of sprinting speed in humans, but they tire out very quickly. We were kind of talking a lot about this in exercise, weren't we? Most people have muscles comprising slightly more than half slow twitch fibers, but the fiber type mixes of athletes fit their sport. So once again, you know, what we were talking about in terms of like the sport chooses the body in a sense, right? The calf muscle of sprinters are 75% or more fast twitch fibers. Athletes who race the half mile, as I did, tend to have, not me, David Epstein, tend to have a mix in their calves closer to 50% slow twitch and 50% fast twitch, with higher fast twitch proportions at the higher levels of competition. And And yeah, so like I said, we talked about this in exercise, but the idea that
we'll be talking about these in every single book. I'm sure about that.
I think we will. But the idea that you also have these hybrid muscle fibers, and basically they're like more adaptable, so they can lean either way depending on what kind of activity you engage in, right? So like we just saw there, people who engage in sprinting, probably like those hybrid are probably more likely to become fast twitch, and marathon runners are more likely to become slow twitch.
This next note I got, which was quite interesting, so this idea that the proportion of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers not only influences the muscle growth potential, but also your ability to burn fat. So apparently studies from the United States and Finland have shown that individuals with a higher proportion of fast twitch fibers have a harder time losing fat despite their ability to build muscle. And this is because fat is primarily burned by slow twitch muscle fibers. Which
I didn't know that.
Interesting. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. It would kind of make sense from the
it would,
right? Because if you need to burn energy quick, everybody knows that it's the creatine, whatever, the phosphagen system, and then and then the I was gonna say what everybody knows. No, it doesn't. It's only because I recently read the book. I think it was an exercise, wasn't it?
Not the what were you talking about?
Phosphagen system.
I don't know about that one.
Okay, I might have been overcoming gravity, but either way, it's the system we used before we even used the glycogen. So sort of using muscle glycogen is for like really explosive movements.
Yeah.
But both of these two systems don't use oxygen and don't have the time to break down fat. Because in the Why We Get Fat book, he talks a lot about the actual process of breaking down fat is so long because you have to go into a fat cell, you have to break down the fat into from its triglyceride into fatty acids to then pull it through the cell, so it just takes ages.
So slow twitch fibers.
So the logic so the logic would make sense that you would be burning more fat in the slow twitch muscles, but whether that holds true, who knows?
It's really interesting.
And then then he goes on to talk about the this idea that having different proportions sort of builds you to different successes in different sports. So like obviously sprinters would have to have a higher proportion of fast twitch, and then basically saying that this is kind of what I was saying earlier, like choosing your sport based upon what you're blessed with, so to speak. And he goes in again saying like, you can't teach speed. So he also does claim, and because this goes counter to what Andy Galpin said on the podcast with Huberman, but he does say that there's been little to no evidence to prove that you can turn from predominantly fast twitch to slow twitch. Let's just say if you predominantly built as fast twitch, like we do have this ability to have baseline, we do have obviously these middle ground sort of fibers which can become either or sort of thing. But if your baseline is like 75% fast twitch, the ability to turn them into slow twitch apparently is not pretty existent. So therefore, once again, it's a case of choosing what you're best built for. And what I thought was quite interesting, and I'm probably going to skip to what was later in the book, is when he talks about this, like we've become so obsessed now on like genetics and how much composition of you are fast twitch, slow twitch. He's like, but the most reliable test of all is just get a stopwatch and make it run. And I'm just like, that's so true. We've got so bogged down in all this, like how much of your composition is fast twitch and slow twitch. Just like let him run and see how quick he runs and decide,
It's so true. It's so true.
But
quite like that.
And then the next chapter is the big bang of body types. And to be honest, we've touched on this so much already. So this is the idea that specific body types are better prepared or more advantageous for specific sports. And he does give a counter example here. So this idea of like where sometimes technique can come in. So Dick Forsberry's Fosbury flop, whatever he's called, basically talks about how this new technique or style of doing the sports or the event created a new body specification that could do it, that would succeed in the sport, which I thought was actually quite an interesting point. So
that's very interesting.
So if the technique and skill changes the body types to execute that specific type of movement you need to win becomes more important. So you can actually change the dynamic of the entire sport by changing the way that the sport is done.
Yeah, that's yeah. So it's almost like the sport and the technique both influence what kind of body type is required.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't pick. I don't think I picked that up in the book actually.
Yeah, it's just here, I think. Wait, yeah. Time to time. Yeah, so from time to time, changes in athletic techniques have swiftly altered the preferred body types. But yeah, actually, I think it's worth quite kind of touching on this as well. So, like, he talks here about in the last 30 years, elite female gymnasts have shrunk from an average of 5'3" to 4'9". Meanwhile, volleyball players, rowers, and football players are getting larger. And basically, what I found really interesting about this is you're just comparing the average body size across the sports, and it's finding that they're sort of converging to this almost ideal. And I thought essentially quite interesting because he talks as well about the market dynamics. So because there's a large proportion of people coming into these sports, watching these sports, enjoying watching these sports, the money has been obviously poured into these sports, and therefore because of that, more people are incentivized to be the best of the best in these sports. Therefore, you're attracting more people. Yeah. And because you're attracting more people, you're having more survival of the fittest, so to speak, battles. Yeah. And the perfect or the more advantageous body types are winning. And therefore, you're seeing a faster convergence to the best performing body type in sports, which I thought was super interesting.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's just that the more popular it becomes, right? The more people are doing it, and the more people, well, the more creme de la creme.
You could then even argue, right? So when you look at sport, the more their body type is the same, the more likely the physiology is required to be good at that sport. So like, obviously, if all sprinters look the same, it's because you need to look like that, or you need to be built like that to run fast.
Yeah.
Whereas, for example, football, because there's obviously elements of it that's not just, physicality based, and there's different values to having, let's just say, somebody who's not so physical, somebody who's like nippy, like what's the word, like agile. There's value in having an agility, right? There's value in having variability on the pitch. You see sports like football, they have variation in body size in comparison to other sports, which tend to all be the same. Yeah. But he basically makes this point that, if you look at, the elite performers, they have such a similar body shape and physiology to each other that they're like completely different to the majority of their the population in general. And I just thought that's quite interesting as well, because basketball, for example, is another sport which requires skills other than just being physical, but it goes to show, because it's such a big advantage in that sport, everybody's just really tall in comparison to stuff like soccer, football, whatever you want to call it. They seem to have a more varied body shape.
I wonder if, off the back of that, I'm just thinking, I could be wrong because I can't remember that well, but Bolt, he's normally taller than most of the the He's quite tall for a sprinter, isn't he?
He has really long legs.
And he has really long legs, which is very different to his who was his training partner, the Beast? I can't remember his name.
Oh, Blake, wasn't it? Blake Masters?
Yeah, something.
Johan Blake.
Johan Blake.
Yeah, he's miles taller. I've just looked at it. And so he's 1.95 meters. That's Usain Bolt. Yeah. And then Johan Blake's 1.8 meters.
Yeah. And I think a lot of sprinters tend to be a bit more muscly and shorter, right? Because it would mean that, if you're sprinting and you're at the forefront of your foot, then there's more momentum going forward, I would assume. Whereas Bolt is kind of a bit of an exception to the rule, and I wonder whether that kind of changes things in terms of scouting and what to look for in terms of people and how whether they can be sprinters, because I reckon you do get a rogue person that comes along that is always a bit of very different.
It's quite interesting that you say that, because I do feel like that's it's like they come and they shake up the whole sporting world because they're so unorthodox, let's just say.
Exactly. And I because really think about it, there's probably a self-perpetuating cycle in terms of the technique that is used to perform a certain sport, right? And so the more you do it, the more it gets taught, and then everyone starts to do it, and then one person has done it without having been taught that and has found a different way of achieving the same success, and then it just throws in a bit of variability.
I guess so. There'll be an interesting one. So I do agree. I think there might be, but then you have to look at some of the limitations of the sport.
There will be,
as we go on later. Remember, there's that cross comparison, I think, of Kenyan runners with Norwegians, and it's not just the fact that they have a slimmer body, so their legs are below their shoulders or something. Because basically, it's more energy efficient, and over time they can save more energy for running at the same pace as somebody else. But maybe what you might get is somebody who's a bit more lankier, but with the same build, who then puts it on the head because he can do way bigger strides. And as long as he can hold off enough energy, he can beat them. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Interesting.
It is. It's one of those things you kind of like, you see it manifest in front of you, right? Like you see all these, like, for example, basketball players that are also tall, but you never really think twice about it. And then you realize actually there is self-selecting forces here based upon, you know, the people who can be the best at sport based upon obviously their advantageous sizes. And as we'll find out in a minute with the basketball, it's not just the height, it's the arm span, which, you know, they have like they have basically syndromes or diseases where their arms are literally longer than their height. And it's just like, that's not normal also. But
that's funny.
So I had one more note here as well on this chapter. So like this idea of the human muscle bookcase, and it's that's it. Each kilogram of bone can support roughly a maximum of 5 kilograms of muscle. So 5-to-1 ratio is the rough amount. I don't know how true that is, but
I don't know how you measure a skeleton.
Oh, I have no idea.
I mean, like, because
also like a living skeleton is different, right? Because when you die, the marrow and stuff like dries up. No, like a living cell in my head would weigh more than a.
Yeah,
I really don't know.
Yeah,
maybe like they probably use some like complicated mathematical shit, you know, where they like they scan you, work out like the volume, you know, length, centimeters, height, you know, that stuff you used to do in physics.
Science.
Science. That's it.
Yeah. Interesting though. I never knew that about how much muscle bone can hold.
Yeah, neither did I. Yeah.
I mean, like 5 times you're probably sorted. I don't think anyone's
going 5 times
try and surpass that unless you're a
what's average human skeleton weight? What the skeleton of most that can't be true. That's bullshit. The skeleton of most males weighs between 2.5 and 3.5 kilograms. But that can't be true because if it's 5 times.
That's not actually, also 5 kilos for like my femur would probably weigh more than that. Surely that can't be right.
That's just bollocks. I don't know. We're gonna have to look into that. The value, the reference value for the skeleton weight of an adult male, 10.5. That's got to be bullshit. Because then you could only ever put 5 times the weight on. So 50 kg is the average weight.
No, I don't want to be dead.
This guy's just chatting poo, isn't he? Oh, actually no, he's saying muscle. So it's not overall weight. He's talking about like specific muscle mass to body weight. So like your organs weigh stuff, your brain weighs. Do you get what I mean? So
but then I wonder how much composition muscles.
So if your body weighs 10 kilograms, you could put 55 kilograms worth of muscle mass, which is that's a lot if you think about it. Because if you
but once again, I don't know how much our muscles weigh, as in like how much of our body is made up of muscles, right? Because if it's like a third, then
I was trying to look up how much like a thigh weighs because obviously it's one of the bigger muscles, but I couldn't find an easy answer. Makes me sound like if somebody starts seeing my internet search history, but like this guy's a cannibal. Like how much does a thigh weigh? What's the circumference?
Like some cannibal or something.
Yeah.
Funny. All right. Well, on to the next one, which is
we got chapter 8, the Vitruvian NBA player. So this is we've been touching on this for so long now, but basically, the vast majority of American men fall within a narrow height range, with 68% measuring between 5'7" and 6'1", whereas the average height of an NBA player is consistently 6'7".
That's fucking huge.
Yes. And only 5% of American men are 6'3" or taller. So basically, the subset of people available to play basketball, I think he goes on to say, is a really small percentage of the total American population. And then he goes on to say the NBA players also have an average arm span to height ratio of 1.063, which is greater than the traditional diagnostic criteria for Marfan syndrome. This means that the average height NBA player with a height of 6'7" has a wingspan of 7 feet.
That's insane.
And then he goes on to say as well that most of the people who are undersized in the NBA, like as in aren't 6'7", are like 6'3", let's just say, because it's all still ridiculously tall, all have this wider arm span to kind of make up for it. And the logic behind it is they have obviously a larger span to block shots and to swipe and try and take balls, etc.
Yeah. And just like what we were talking about with how, over time sports have converged, like the body type for certain sports have converged towards a kind of ideal. Well, the same thing has occurred with basketball, as in it's just like people are getting taller and taller and people are getting drafted from abroad. And he was saying essentially, like, if you're 7 foot, and then you've got like a really high chance of just being drafted for and you play basketball, you've got a high chance of being
if you're 7 foot and you're coordination, get yourself to the NBA.
Exactly. Or that you've got really, really long arms, then capitalize on it.
What is that? There's like a scary monster, isn't there? With really long arms, like Slender Man. Isn't it? Yeah. Can you remember
Slender Man? Yeah. Essentially, they're coming up to him, and be like, "Hi, would you be interested in
God's sake,
playing a bit of NBA?" But when you think about it, like when you actually like outside of basketball, seeing a person who is 6'5" to 7 foot, I don't think I've ever seen someone who's 7 foot. I may have like once, but I didn't go and measure him. But that's huge, right? Like, and the
I still remember going to the Bristol Zoo. Do you remember the Bristol Zoo when you used to be able to like go to like the elephant area and they used to have like the tallest human in comparison to elephants, and like you still look up and be like, Jesus Christ, that was somebody who was alive that height. Yeah, oh, my God.
I mean, he mentions a person in this book who was the son of 2 of the tallest like NBA players or like basketball players in China, and they were like purposely put together. But he was 7'5". Like
that's crazy.
That's huge. Bloody hell. But yeah,
I'm actually googling that compared to an elephant, see if I can see it. Can't see it, but yeah. So the next point I thought was really interesting. Like I added his book to the want to read list, and the book's called Fetus into Man. So this guy was a growth expert, so he's just followed obviously people's from young to into adults, and he also looked at identical twins and brothers, etc. And what I found really interesting was this took a pair of identical twins. They were separated at birth and were raised in vastly different environments. So one was brought up in a nurturing household, while the other was subjected to abuse, being locked up in a dark room and made to beg for water. So
what are these like fucking environments? These scientific studies,
I don't know if this was like one of those ones where it was like planned in advance, or whether he was. I'm sure it wasn't planned in advance.
No, I hope.
But as adults, the brother that was raised in the nurturing household was 3 inches taller, but their body proportions were similar, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. Well, so like essentially, when you talk about
the twin was simply a shrunken version of the other guy. I was like,
well, essentially, so like if you take height as a trait, okay, so its heritability rate is 0.8, which is probably the highest for any traits that we're aware of. So essentially that means that of the 20%, okay, this explains the variability in the population. And so there are things that will explain that 20%. 80% of that is like genes, but the 20% is like explains the variability. So in this case, there can be environmental factors that impact height, which we wouldn't think would do. But like, for instance, if you're ill when you're a child, apparently that's supposed to affect your height.
You'd assume some form of nutrition, like this in this case.
Nutrition, exactly.
Stuff which fuels the growth, right? That's going to cause some issues.
But yeah, no, it is interesting. Like, but it's just amazing how little. So like, essentially, what they do association tests. So they'll get like a big group of people, and they'll sequence their DNA, and it's really expensive. But essentially, they'll take a big group of people, they'll sequence all their DNA, and then they'll be looking for a particular trait, in this case, height, and then they'll look for all of the DNA variations that explain it, right? So all of these single nucleotide polymorphisms. So essentially what that is, if you have your DNA sequence, in your DNA, you have 3 billion pairs, okay, of
just
these,
3 billion
of these nucleotides, and nucleotide bases are like essentially, the codes in your DNA.
Yeah.
And there are different variations along those, along that strand. There's roughly 25,000 genes, And in those genes, there are variations in those single polymorphism nucleotides. And those are all the things that like these studies essentially collect, and then they establish this variation has 0.00012% contribution to height. And so that's why like so many of these traits have like they're polymorphisms, because it means that there's loads of
it just sounds so super complicated that I don't know how you'd ever figure it all out and ever,
I don't think we ever will.
Yeah,
to be honest, it's so complex. But yeah. So that was a little tangent.
I love it when you talk genetics to me. Right.
On to the next one.
Chapter 9, why we're all black, sort of. So this is where I start going into ethnicities a little bit, which I can imagine might be controversial to some people. Basically, they found upon examining Olympic athletes that individuals of African descent tend to have a more linear physique. This is evidenced by longer legs and a more narrow pelvic breadth. So which I thought was quite an interesting idea, that it allows more energy efficiency, I believe. I can't remember exactly what it was.
That would make sense, I think.
Because you're placing the weights directly above weight. I can't remember the notes. This is the... Oh, and then this was an interesting part as well. So according to a report, black adults have a center of mass approximately above the belly button. No, that's approximately 3% higher than white adults. So their center of mass is 3% higher than white adults, the same height. So using engineering models of bodies moving through fluids such as air or water, they calculated that this 3% difference results in a 1.5% advantage in running speeds for athletes with higher belly buttons, which is quite interesting. Like, once again, if you really take it down to sort of like the actual physiology and like biomechanics and working out from like a physics first principles approach, you can actually work out that somebody might have an advantage based upon the dimensions and the center of body mass.
I'm literally trying to see whether I have a high belly button or not. I don't know.
If it's up by your nipples, mate, I think you should go to the doctor.
Yeah. Is this it? Right. I don't know what constitutes a high belly button, but interesting.
Yeah, I just thought it was just interesting to know that on average they have a different physiological profile, and then if you look at what they succeed in, or what they're better at in terms of what sporting events they're better at, is there a reason that this difference? Is there a reason? Yeah, is the reason why they're better at this sport caused by the difference in their physiology?
Well, there's another point here which I thought was really interesting, just because I'd never come across it before. So it's called Allen's rule.
Yeah.
So Joseph Asaph Allen, an American zoologist, published a groundbreaking paper in 1877 in which he observed that as one approaches the equator, the extremities of animals become longer and slimmer. This is evident in the case of elephants, where African elephants have larger floppy ears than their Asian counterparts. The larger ears act as a radiator to release heat, and due to their larger surface area compared to volume, can release heat more efficiently. This adaptation has occurred due to the African elephant's proximity to the equator. This observation, known as Allen's rule, has been applied to humans through numerous studies that show that individuals from warmer climates tend to have longer limbs. And this, I think, would somewhat, explain, or not explain, but would justify the what we were talking about last, or whenever we did exercise, with the fact that we can sweat. We have sweat glands all over ourselves, and so in this case we could perspire more. In hot countries,
by having longer limbs, you'd have bigger surface area to perspire. Yeah,
exactly. Which was interesting, I thought.
Well, it's interesting explanation. I think it obviously could be true. It's really one of those things that's quite hard to test because you've got a theory that fits the data already. Do you know what I mean? You've seen the data and you fit a theory to it, but
also I think there was that point that, like, it's not just a matter of like, if I start walking towards the equator, my legs get longer. It's more that, like, if your ancestors have originated from an area close to the equator, then you're more likely to have longer legs.
Yeah, when I think of that, I just gonna walk to the equator. My legs are just gonna.
You're 7 foot when you get there, and then
that's it. Then I'll be a basketball player in no time. See you in the NBA.
Funny. No.
The next part, I think, the next part was talking about the gene variation.
Mhm.
And I thought it was quite interesting, this idea of like I took a note on the gene variant to digest lactose. I just thought it was really interesting that obviously quite a lot of people can't digest lactose. It's one of those things I guess we take for granted. And then one of the other notes I got here, which I really thought was interesting, was this doping variant. I don't know if you took that note or you saw that bit as well, which is the way that we currently test for doping involves a specific TE ratio or something, so testosterone to epitestosterone ratio. And basically, some people have a gene which allows them to technically dope with testosterone, and they won't show up on this test because the test tests something where they don't excrete the testosterone in that way. So basically, they have a variant which allows them to dope. And it's just, I just thought that was crazy that you can actually have like a genetic thing which allows you to cheat almost. It's a weird thought.
Yeah, no, I do remember coming across that. That was really interesting. I wonder how they account for it. Like,
they must have a bypass, right? They must have a way that they
But is there no signal, like other than testosterone, like that you've injected?
I would assume now because they've noticed it, they would probably do like double. They test probably for testosterone in the blood as well. I guess I don't know.
Yeah.
In my head, if they're going to test you, they're going to test you for everything. I would have thought,
Yeah, you think
there's so many different advantages you can like take. I guess I find it even more interesting when you can not dope but have such an advantage biologically that you look like you're doping. That's just an interesting part as well.
Fucking hell. There's so much more complexity when you actually dive into it.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things that it's like, oh, why don't you just find the dopers and kick them out? It's like, well, actually, some people can literally be in a point where their biology puts them at a level where they could be doping because they're so genetically blessed in a way, I guess, so to speak, with the specific system you need to to excel in this sport. So then we move on to chapter 10, so the warrior slave theory of Jamaican sprinting. I thought this was quite interesting because this was trying to work out why Jamaica has such amazing success in sprinting in general, and they have done for years now. And what I quite liked about this is I think it was 2 chapters, or maybe maybe it was just 1 chapter, but he basically took us through some research done by 2 different guys. One of them came up with a theory about the athletic slave, wasn't it, or something like this, or it was like the warrior slave. So he was arguing that there's like a hereditary passing down of strong slavery genes because apparently in the past people were shipped to Jamaica if they were like the strongest of slaves, so to speak, right? If I remember correctly. But then there was another researcher who took the approach that actually part of the reason why Jamaica, apart from obviously being blessed with other athletic advantages such as like longer legs, etc., like that, they also have a very good system for catching running talent and early. And because like what we have, I guess, in the UK with football being the main sport, in Jamaica, my understanding was that sprinting is like their like national sport, right?
Yeah. So
they have a lot of like status and a lot of money and systems set up to collect or to find talented runners and nurture them from a young age. Yeah. And I thought it was quite interesting because it's something we kind of just we take for granted. Like when you hear of our Jamaican sprinters, you just think, oh, that tiny country that's outperforming everybody else in the Olympics. But little do you know, behind that, they actually have like every school has like a specific race, if I remember correctly, where people basically get scouted.
Yeah, and
runners.
All kids go through it. Right?
Yeah, literally. Yeah.
I think that's what's really interesting. You know, we take it for granted, like you said, here in the UK, for example, you have multiple sports that anyone has the choice to do, and so they don't all go and test through one sport, right? Whereas like if you had everyone go through one sport, then you'd probably have a higher chance of finding people who really excel at it. But some people just, for instance, in this country, may never even get the chance or may never even think about doing it. Mm-hmm. And we'll touch on it later, but the idea also like corresponds with Kenya and how a lot of them, you know, they their main sport, they're not a rich country. And so their main kind of sport, their only kind of sport is like running, essentially. And the same thing kind of goes for Jamaica as well, you know. And it's kind of interesting that in these kind of countries, because they don't have the luxury of engaging in loads of different sports, they end up actually honing in on one sport that they're really good at.
And also it's the highest valued sport from my understanding as well. Like you almost like, because Usain Bolt's a bit of like a cult figure over there, like a hero, like an icon that everybody wants to be. And I do think it's quite interesting that the icons of a society tend to push people towards those. Like, for example, now, right, like all these kids want to be like YouTube celebrities, influencers, because they become like the new icons to some people. And it's just quite interesting because that itself generates like a cultural influence, which pushes people into these specific things. Absolutely. And obviously, if you have Usain Bolt being paraded as like the country's icon, you're more likely to then have people motivated to pursue these like sort of careers, or like careers, or like these, pursuing sprinting, so to speak. I just thought it was interesting because it's one of those things we never really get to see into, but obviously in this book it's a researcher who was based in Jamaica who was like following this and kind of surmised that if anybody had this system, they would be cranking out better sprint talent. Maybe not winning everything, because obviously then other things come into account, so not just the 10,000 hours, but the physiology and stuff. But if everybody had the system, they probably have a better overall sprinting talent. Sprinting,
they probably have better performance across the board though, wouldn't like I'm not talking
whatever
about...
you pay attention to and whatever you push people who are talented towards, if anything, I think one of the reasons why many other countries maybe haven't had such success is because they're not promoting or pushing the best talent to do it. Exactly. Like people aren't being discovered. They aren't realizing that they have it's a bit like these people who can walk the street and run time of VO2 max. Like if you get these people actually, like if you can find a way to find them, because they probably didn't even realize they have that ability, because for them it's just normal. They can run really quick and they just think, oh, I'm quick. Their friends go, oh, you're really quick, but they didn't think, I'm going to test myself against. No, it's a really good point. Like, and I'm not for like forcing people to play certain sports, but actually, like, there is always athletics day, isn't there? That everyone kind of to a degree has to engage in. We always get forced into it, right? Like it's Most people it's funny as well, because most people think because they're untrained they're going to lose. They actually don't try, do they? They're like, oh, I didn't try. I remember like being one of the only people who used to try, so I'd end up doing all right. I would never like win, but I'd be in the top amount. But it's only because nobody else is bloody trying. It's just like you are like, how many undiscovered, like there must be so much undiscovered talent of people who just didn't bother trying, but actually could be really good at specific sports. It's a travesty. All
that lost potential. No, it was an interesting chapter. So on to the next one. Actually, this one was quite interesting. Malaria and muscle fibers. So differing hemoglobin levels. And I thought essentially what was he talking about? That West Africans had kind of evolved to combat malaria. So I think malaria, doesn't it work by something to do with affecting hemoglobin levels or oxygen in the blood?
Something like that, and by a byproduct they have lower hemoglobin levels by default, which basically people were thinking would put you at a athletic disadvantage, because hemoglobin is what carries oxygen around your body to the cells for energy. But they have like some sort of compensation mechanism, don't they? I forgot. I'm trying to find out exactly what it was again. Because basically the finding was that low hemoglobin is a disadvantage for endurance sports. But the fact that obviously many Kenyan runners with this gene have proven to be very good endurance runners, therefore there must be something that's combating this.
So was this for endurance sports or? Yeah,
this is mainly for endurance sports. This is
it? Okay. Yeah. All right. What is it? So we might as well just read this bit. So based on data from nearly 30,000 people across 10 states with age ranges from infancy to old age, a study revealed that African Americans have lower hemoglobin levels at every stage of life than white Americans, even when their diet and socioeconomic status are taken into account. Faye Whitburn, the former head of Jamaica's National Public Health Laboratory Services, reported that Jamaicans' hemoglobin levels are similar to those of African Americans. This finding has been replicated in several studies and population data from the U.S. National Center of Health Statistics, including among athletes. A 2010 study of 715,000 blood donors across America found that African Americans have a lower genetic set point for hemoglobin, regardless of environmental factors like nutrition. Although endurance sports may be affected by the genetic disadvantage of having
so I think you're right, by the way. I think it was not endurance. It's fast twitch related sports. Yeah,
because it would make sense that the compensation mechanism would be to do with non-oxygen fitness, which would be non-endurance and more like anaerobic
and powerful. Power movements.
Yeah, because I think it somewhat explains why sprinters tend to hail from West African countries. In a paper published in the Journal of National Medical Association, the authors noted that African Americans have lower hemoglobin levels than white Americans at all stages. Oh, no, wait, we've had that bit. Some scientists have suggested that African Americans may have compensatory mechanisms to make up for the lack of oxygen-carrying hemoglobin. This led Cooper to investigate further. Cooper found a potential compensatory mechanism in 1986 study by Bouchard and colleagues from Laval University in Quebec. The study compared muscle samples from sedentary students of African descent and white students who were identical in age, height, and weight. The African students had higher proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers and lower proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers than the white students. They also had higher activity in metabolic pathways that require less oxygen and are used during all-out sprints. The researchers concluded that the African students were well endowed for sport events of short duration compared to white students, which I think is really interesting. Just this kind of like evolutionary adaptation to dealing
and like
with
trade-off.
environment.
It's like a trade-off he's got here. It's like a trade-off for like, reducing the hemoglobin amount to then favor the sort of faster twitch. It's a trade-off they had to make to survive the fact it was it was a malaria area.
Yeah.
It was, it sounds weird when I say it like that.
You're going to start breaking into a rap or something.
Oh God, the malaria area. But what I thought was quite interesting as well, because he made his next point saying like, it's actually not just it's not like the whole of Africa that was affected by this, but actually the areas such as what we're going on to next, like Kenya, where they have a higher altitude and they have they have less mosquitoes. They don't actually have the same adaptation. So once again, it's like an adaptation based upon the area you're based in because of the environmental selection factors, right? It's just fascinating. So the next chapter goes into can every Kelinjin run? And this is, I believe, an ethnic tribe within Kenya. And these are where the most famous runners or Kenyan runners are from. Yeah. Like what I thought this is so interesting, this bit. So consider the following statistics. Only 17 American men in history have completed a marathon in under 2 hours and 10 minutes. So like 17 ever, which is equivalent to a pace of 4 minutes and 58 seconds per mile, which is rapid.
That is
rapid. In October 2011 alone, 32 Kelinjin men achieved this feat.
That's
just crazy.
It's insane.
And then this, for instance, while only 5 American high schoolers have ever run a mile under 4 minutes, St. Patrick's High School in near 10, which is in Kenya, once had 4 sub-4 milers attending the high school simultaneously. Just built different. I mean, here again, he sort of as well talks about this idea that it's similar to Jamaica. They have a systemized process of identifying like talent. And I do believe in this chapter, he did go on as well to talk about there was a lot of physical activity related to walking to and from school from a young age. That people
a lot of running, I think.
Put for a lot of endurance from a young age.
Yeah.
But then it goes really into the details. I think we were talking about it a little bit earlier of the differences. So there was a research program done in 1998 by the University of Copenhagen's Muscle Research Center. So it conducted a study to investigate the theories surrounding the Kelinjin distance running dominance, including the possibility of a high proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers, higher aerobic capacity, and a quicker response to endurance training. So the study included elite runners from the Kelinjin boys from both rural and urban areas, and then Danish boys living in Copenhagen. So in general, the conclusions did not provide evidence for any of the theories that was investigated. So the elite runners from the Kelinjin tribe did not differ on average in their proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers to the Danish boys. So Kelinjin boys from the villages, so the ones from the villages did have a higher VO2 max than Kelinjin boys from the city, who were much less active. But it was a similar VO2 max to the active Danish boys. So therefore the VO2 max wasn't different. As expected from the latitudes of the ancestry, the Kelinjin and Danish boys did display body type differences. So a greater portion of the body length of the Kelinjin boys was composed of legs. So the Kelinjin boys were on average 2 inches shorter than the Danish boys, but had legs that were about 3/4 of an inch longer. And then the scientists' most unique finding, though, was not the length of the legs, but their girth. The volume and average thickness of the lower legs of the Kelinjin boys was 15 to 17% less than in Danish boys.
Yeah.
This finding is substantial because the leg is akin to a pendulum, and the greater the weight at the end of the pendulum, the more energy is required to swing it. And then I thought this bit was super interesting.
Yeah.
So, like, why do slim legs matter? So the distal weight, which refers to the weight on the limbs, is a disadvantage for distance runners. A research team found that adding just 1/10 of 1 pound to an ankle can increase oxygen consumption during running by about 1%. So the Kelinjin runners tested by Danish scientists had almost a pound less weight in their lower legs compared to the Danish, resulting in energy savings of 8% per kilometer. This is their running economy, which measures how much oxygen a runner uses to run at a certain pace, which is important, obviously, for running long distances. So untrained Kelinjin boys had better running economy than untrained Danish boys due to their proportionally long and thin legs.
I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's just mental. Because there's, especially in long distance, right? Every kilometer you're saving 8%. So you do that over 20 kilometers. It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah. And like what I liked about that study is that they took that weight and they put it near the hips first, and it had like a negligible difference, and then they put it down by the ankles, and it had a huge difference in terms of the amount of energy conserved.
I wonder that's why shoe weight matters a lot to runners.
I would assume so. Yeah.
Yeah. But the lighter the better, right?
Yeah. You'd think so.
Yeah. But yeah, that was. I thought it's fascinating, and it's just one of these things that you kind of explain the physiology, the biomechanics behind the domination in long distance running.
Yeah. And I think, it really emphasizes the fact that how like your environment and your culture really shapes your genes. So in this regard, the Kelinjin tribe, I think I can't remember what the word was, but it was talking about how part of their, I can't remember what it was, but they would basically go and run after cattle, and it would require them to run hundreds of up to 100 miles, and it would be at night, funnily enough, which I wonder whether that had led to certain adaptations. So they would be running for a long time, and so it just goes to show you that that kind of has shaped them. And I think he goes on in the book later on saying that other tribes also who engage in this kind of, I can't remember what it was, ways of like stealing cattle, funnily enough, they exhibit similar adaptations, and they are also very good at running. And it's just quite interesting about how that really shapes you. In this case, I don't think any Danish people did that. Yeah,
of course, yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just quite interesting.
That's a good point. They weren't doing that,
no. Okay, so on to the next one. So the world's greatest accidental altitudinous talent sieve. So what was? Remind me.
This chapter was talking about the altitude difference, why Kenya has an advantage because it's higher. And then I think they believed there was another, the Ethiopians as well have a very high base altitude. And it's something to do with, I think they have a increased amount of hemoglobin. Let me just double check again. Because basically they're talking about there's a common belief, and I think I don't know where we've learned this, but I definitely learned it somewhere that altitude training increases the amount of hemoglobin. The theory is if you go and train at a higher altitude, your body will compensate and create more hemoglobin, right?
Yeah.
And then what was this? So in 1995, a team led by Bill studied the Amhara ethnic group in Ethiopia who live at 11,600 feet along the Rift Valley, and found that they had normal levels of hemoglobin and oxygen saturation, unlike other populations at high altitude who have adapted by increasing their hemoglobin levels, such as what we would probably go through if we moved there. So the Amhara people were able to move oxygen unusually rapidly from their lungs into the blood. Being born at altitude can lead to larger lungs, allowing for more oxygen to pass from the lungs into the blood. This adaptation occurs not only in natives of the Himalayas, but also among American children who grew up in the Rockies. While altitude alone doesn't necessarily create great distance runners, it can be helpful to have sea level ancestry to elevate hemoglobin quickly upon training at altitude, and be born at altitude to develop larger lung surface area. Okay, that was it. So they, from being born at a higher altitude, they didn't have the higher hemoglobin adaptation, but they had larger lungs. And basically the point being here, like I think what she's trying to say is if you were born,
if you go down to normal altitude, then you can carry more.
But I think her point being there, like the best of the best would be if you had the larger lung capacity, but also the ability to adapt to being in a higher altitude. So you'd increase the hemoglobin, but also have a larger lung capacity. Which I think she's kind of claiming they have. I guess I don't. Yeah. But either way, it was just like another interesting point about another advantage they have. So not only just having this like, economy of running, but they also then have an oxygen advantage through the fact they have a larger lung surface area based upon the environmental pressures that have, given rise to those genes.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just reading this now.
So the first note I took was more about the standard understanding of altitude and how it affects our hemoglobin levels. If anybody's interested in that, the book summary will be on the website, so you can check that out.
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand why Ethiopians don't because he constantly makes a point of it in the book that Kenyans are like the top runners, and maybe that is partly because of their environment and like them having to run school and those kinds of things,
and the culture. Like they have a system, like you're saying, they have a system that selects like the Jamaican system.
Ethiopia doesn't have that yet, do they?
Yeah, well, they're coming to it. I think that once again, the more stars and icons you can have, it inspires. Right, that's the whole point of sports heroes. They inspire the younger generation to follow in their footsteps, so to speak.
But
yeah. I think that was that for that chapter. Then we move into the final few. So chapter 14 was about sled dogs, ultra runners, and couch potato genes. To summarize this entire chapter, it was talking about the Arctic sled racing, I believe, where the dogs, it's Huskies, isn't it? Huskies sled race. And he basically, in this chapter, talked about how they selected or how they created the best team of sled running dogs. And the trait they wanted wasn't even based upon physicality, so to speak. He wanted a dog that loved to run or loved to train. So this whole chapter is more about the genetics of of hunger, so to speak, or like being addicted to training, or being having a gene which I guess you become excited by the force of training, so to speak. And I thought it was quite interesting because it's another genetic component where you didn't think about it, but some people can have a gene which makes them more likely to want to train, more likely to enjoy the training. And
it's something that like we constantly got taught in our modules that think of any behavior. Does it have a genetic proponent to it? Yes. Is it explained by genes? Yes. To what degree? I don't know. But the fact is that all of our genes essentially explain all of our behavior to a degree.
To some degree, because I was going to say, if you look at like goal setting and goal chasing and the dopaminergic system, your dopaminergic system set up by your genes. So if you're somebody who's like highly driven by or has a high level of baseline dopamine, you're constantly chasing after things. That's genetically set up, right? So therefore, it's caused by the gene, so to speak.
And it was interesting, just as like I'm fully aware of how dog breeding occurs to get certain traits. But what 2 points. One was that it's been bred so many times now. So for instance, in this case, he had one dog who epitomized, who that loved to run. And so he bred it with loads of dogs and built a whole team or a whole sled
running addicts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But they basically were saying that running dogs or sled dogs have been bred so many times that they essentially just look like a new breed of dog, just as a husky to a pug. It's not really a husky anymore. It's literally a running dog, a sled dog. I just thought that was quite interesting that that's how differentiated they have become. And then the second point was this example of this woman who, she was an ultra marathon runner and absolutely just loves to run all the time and gets anxious when she doesn't. And I thought that was an interesting point that there are probably people who we perceive as they're a bit crazy that they want to do
Obsessive,
this stuff so much.
speak,
Obsessive,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
But that might be a genetic component
Yeah,
towards that kind of
in my head,
activity, right?
obsessiveness, it has to be. It's like some
I
sort of
think so,
flaw in
yeah.
the dopaminergic system, or whatever. So
Yeah.
they're like addicted to like chasing the next milestone or whatever. And they like, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you can, over time, I think we were saying this before about, habits and identity change, where like, obviously we work out a bit now, whereas I feel guilty for not working out, whereas in the past I used to happily never work out, right? So there is a level where you can train yourself to be like that, and then eventually I can imagine that getting to the point where it becomes like, parasitic, almost like bad for you, where you're so addicted that you can't just not do it because you beat yourself up. There's so much shame and pain involved with not doing the training, let's just say.
Exactly. But that's kind of all I got from this chapter.
Yeah. And then the chapter 15 was the heartbreak gene, death, injury, and pain on the field. So this, to summarize this chapter, there was a talk of a cardio gene, wasn't it? And it was talking about how sometimes people just drop dead based upon
sudden death syndrome is essentially what it is, isn't it? And essentially, I think it's basically when I always get them mixed up, the atrium and the ventricles. The one that's basically receives the blood, is it the ventricles?
I don't know.
But basically, it like there's a fault, and so it isn't able to take in as much blood, and then the heart is still pumping out blood, and so essentially it kind of like it's a backlog, and it gets clogged up, and essentially you end up. It doesn't sound very nice. You end up drowning in your own like water. And yes, it was basically saying that it's a rare gene, but you do see it in some people like who train to a certain level. Suddenly it can just like kick in. He mentioned this like one family. It sounded dreadful. Like
the runner, wasn't it? Right at the end of the run, wasn't it? He collapsed.
Well, so there was there was that, but I was also going to say like there was this family where they had identified. Oh no! So these two brothers were like playing, and one of them just like happened to just suddenly had this cardiac arrest. And it turned out that he had this gene, and then so they all got scanned or something, and it turned out that this other brother had it as well, and then he ended up dying when he was like on a treadmill, and so their sister was like a bit on edge, and then when she had kids, she scanned her kids, and it turned out like 3 of them had it as well, and it was just like imagine having a gene that means that you're not able to engage in physical activity.
But it's more like strenuous physical activity, isn't it? But
it is, but like how do you?
It's still scary, isn't it? Because like rolling a dice every time you get on the treadmill, right? Like it's like, oh, am I going to die today when I decide to go for a run?
Exactly.
It's fucking terrifying.
I think there is something to be said for like he did mention that some people hold this gene or different variations of these genes and have not shown. The same thing have not occurred when they engage in like strenuous activity. And this is the thing with like all these genes, that there's so many variations. And if we haven't, like realistically, we haven't sequenced all people's DNA. So we can't know all of the genetic variants responsible for certain traits. So, we might scan one family and they might hold a variant that, says that it contributes to this, but we don't know how much because we can't compare it to anyone else.
Oh yeah, I remember reading it and thinking, Jesus, like it's one of those things you probably want to get tested for just in case. You never know, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And then I think one of the only other notes I took is this idea as well of pain. So some people have like different pain thresholds, and it talks about the fact that people who have no perception of pain actually end up dying younger, and it kind of makes sense because you can like injure yourself really badly and not realize you need to take time off to repair and just consistently just keep prolonging your injuries to the point of I guess eventual death, so to speak.
Those people die really, really young. Like it sounds like a kind of superpower when you think about it.
But it's not, is it?
But
like,
it's not. Like people can have like a huge gash and just like die of blood loss because they can't.
They didn't detect they've got it, right? It's pretty nuts. And then the very last chapter, I think, was the chapter 16, the gold medal mutation. So I didn't take too many notes on this either. This was another example of, genetic factors. And it was a cross-country skier, I believe, and his name was Eero Mantrianta. He competed in 4 Winter Olympics and he won 7 medals. So what was his advantage again? So
essentially he had like a huge amount of red blood cells, didn't he? Because I think similar to the kind of like my-statin thing, there wasn't a cap. Like there's probably a lot more complexity to it, but essentially it's also explained his complexion, which was quite red because he had a lot of red blood cells, which weirdly, I wonder if, oh no, it doesn't matter. I was going to say when there's like a lot of oxygen in his blood, whether his color changes slightly, but that wouldn't make sense. I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, basically he did incredibly well at the Olympics. And I think he won like 4 gold or something and loads of other like competitions. And essentially, obviously, the more blood you have, the more oxygen you can take in. And hence he was kind of looking at this, and this gene was like present in his family. And I think his brother also was like had won the junior world championships or something like that. And so it seemed to run in his family. But on that note, his upbringing, first of all, it sounded like it's amazing when like you read about people's upbringings in like the early 1900s and how much poverty there was. You know, he would have to ski to school across a lake. All right. And because he's in Lapland in Finland, it means that sometimes there would only be 3 hours of daylight a day. So he would be skiing to school in pitch black across a frozen lake. Like, I don't like, you know, you can't even.
It's actually kind of scary as well. Like, one of the lake frozen lakes creep me out a little bit. Oh,
it also gets pitch black.
And it's, you don't know where you're going.
And it was saying like you couldn't see the other ends at the other edge of the lake, so you just hoped that you were going in the right direction. Like
different,
fucking hell,
built different.
But so he would ski. So just as like the Kenyans would run to school, he would ski to school, and then to get a better job in that kind of area, he was put on like Watch the Border or something as like a skier. And so all of these things, you know, obviously added to his success and probably why he was such a well-acclaimed cross-country skier. But also this gene did show to have
just through the affiliation of his rest of his family, he went on to win you know, skiing awards, like top tier, you know. I mean, arguably you could say it runs like, you know, maybe because it was such a cultural thing within the family, they all skied more. I don't know. There's other arguments to be had, but he did say that this is one of the, you know, ones that showcases the power of genetics the most. So and that was pretty much it. And then he had like a little epilogue talking about, you know, a synopsis of everything we've just discussed, and obviously how it's obviously a mix between nature and nurture.
Absolutely.
The sports specific bodies you should look for what you're best at. And I quite liked, I was saying it to you the other day about you know, the last thing he said, so like everybody is a different genotype, therefore for optimal development everyone should have a different environment, and then happy training. I thought that was quite a nice end. It's like we're all built differently, we all require different things. Happy experimenting, happy figuring it out, you know. If you thought you're going to come to this book and find a one size fits all answer to how you should train, it's so if anything, it's kind of proved the opposite. It's like you're so individual that you need to be considering your individual needs to create the ideal training program. No,
absolutely. It was interesting. I liked some of the stories. I just didn't. It wasn't what I expected in terms of how I thought it was going to apply like genetics as a field to sports, but. Essentially, you know, your environment, your culture, your upbringing, all shapes, you know, especially over time, shapes what genes you have. And then as we have developed these sports in our society, especially with like the Olympics and the pursuit of certain sports, we have slowly honed in on particular bodies that seem to fit that kind of sport. Right.
You know what? I would be surprised in the future if there's like other countries who have very specific environments that have created other physiological adaptations who come in who don't even take part in the Olympics at the moment because there are not enough people give a fuck. But like in 10 years time, they're like dominating the sprinting stage because they've got adaptations that are just, you know, even better than what we currently have, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Or like, if you think about it, right, like running is running. It's evolved from probably, well, like we said last week, or with exercise, it's evolved from hunting, right? Like the need to hunt or the need to avoid, and survive. And it's been turned into a sport. So we take these things that we kind of engage in, that people have engaged in for millennia, essentially, and then we turn it somewhat into a sport. And I wonder if certain things will also be turned into sports, and so those countries will start to excel, and then down the line it will select for certain body types. But it
was a long one today, but we got through it all in one go. So that was The Sports Gene by David Epstein.
I think the next book, is it the World's Fittest book, or is it, or we're doing a section of Overcoming Gravity?
We can either or. So either way, it'll be fitness related.
Yeah.
I think we're going to go more into the sort of nooks and crannies of actually building a training program and what you should be looking for, etc. And then we'll go on to other areas such as nutrition, recovery, etc. So stay tuned.
Looking forward to it. All right.
That's a wrap.
That is a wrap. Hey guys, well there you have it. We hope you enjoyed that book summary. Now we know it can be a lot to take in all at once, so if you want to be able to read this in a more palatable size, or you want to be able to implement any of those key actionable ideas that we were talking about in this episode, head on over to our website at wisewords.blog, where the book summary will be waiting for you. Also, don't forget to check out our socials, as we consistently upload the key ideas, benefits, and actionable ideas from all the books that we read. The links to those will be in the description below. Now, we want to be able to get you the best content in a way that's really easy to understand, but we need your help. Your opinion matters. So you are our feedback mechanism. And with those quick actions, whether that's leaving us a like or a dislike, commenting in the comment section below, or subscribing to our channel, all of those help us gauge what we're doing well and how to improve on our method of delivery. So if you have any thoughts on the matter, don't hesitate to act. It takes less than 10 seconds and it really helps us out. But with all that being said, until next time, stay wise.